First, quickly, thanks for all of you for showing up. Thanks to Ian Score of Sandbox Solar for helping line up the Powerhouse and the Energy Institute as well. This is a great location. And thanks to Pat Connors of PRPA, Greg Martin of NREL, and Dan Zimmerle of CSU's Energy Institute, our panelists. Obviously, we're here to talk about integrating 100% renewable energy. As many of you are aware, Fort Collins, Longmont, Estes Park, Loveland, and Platte River Power Authority, our joint action agency that provides us electricity, have set pretty aggressive 100% renewable energy and zero carbon goals. In years past, it's been really popular to do that through getting to net zero, doing offsets. But what we're looking to do here is really kind of push that approach to true 100% energy, pursuing zero carbon scenarios. And this drive really requires a much more dynamic and intensive management approach to the grid compared to the past. So as we look at that, there have been recent studies from NREL and others showing feasibility of 60%. Some of the more aggressive approaches look at 80% attainable on the grid, with relatively existing technologies. But the reality is there are a lot of challenges even to getting to that 60 and 80 and definitely in pursuing beyond that. So the panel here, we're going to look at discussing existing grid technologies, how we evolve those along with new technologies to really be able to push past net zero in pursuit of zero carbon scenarios while still maintaining an electrical system that's not only clean but reliable, affordable, and resilient. So I'll go ahead and kick it off to the panelists. If you just quickly introduce yourself, talk about your work, and list perhaps the top 3 technologies that you think are going to help us pursue 100% renewable energy.
You want me to go first? Okay, I'm Dan Zimmerle. I actually work in this building, so welcome. I'm going to talk a little bit about a few of the research projects that we've been working on, but one of the things I want to talk about first of all is that we've been working with Fort Collins utilities folks to really model in detail how the distribution system in Fort Collins works. And so they've shared with us a large amount of data, not just on the solar panels and solar systems, but also how the electrical topology of the town, meter data, etc., so that we can have a pretty complete picture of the electrical system in Fort Collins. And as part of that, my team pulls data from Fort Collins utilities on a regular basis. And so I actually have the latest information that we have, which is about January, about where Fort Collins is. And so I thought you might be interested in that. Remember, Fort Collins is about a 330 megawatt peaking load. Okay, so keep that in the back of your mind. So our peak load in Fort Collins is about 330 megawatts. So right now there are 12.6 megawatts of installed capacity in the city, not counting the big arrays that Carroll and company have out on the foothills, the big ones that CSU's PV arrays out on the foothills campus. Of 1,350 distributed PV systems we have around town, 1,232 of those are residential systems. The average size is about 5.5 kilowatts, and the median size about 5.2 kilowatts. Our numbers, if we looked at kind of roof area and tempering that a little bit, is that size is probably 2/3 or 75% of what should be installed if you were going to actually kind of reasonably do your kind of cover your roof with PV. So the median size of the non-residential systems is 65 kilowatts, or the mean is, and the median is 10, so there's a couple of big systems and lots of small systems. So one of the interesting things is our highest penetration feeder in Fort Collins is in the north here, and it has a 4% of the residences on that feeder have PV, okay? And averaged over the entire city, it's about 1.5%, which I think on national levels, you can probably fill this in. That's not a trivial penetration, so I think that's pretty interesting. Okay, and the largest non-residential PV system that's kind of distributed around the town is the Bella site, which is about 970 megawatts, which is kind of up in the northeast corner of town. Or not 970 kilowatts, sorry.
We wish it was
About a megawatt. Okay, so I thought those would be interesting, just kind of kick off the discussion, sort of give you an idea of sort of the size. What we're doing with that study is actually understanding, first of all, how we would model the system over an extended period of time. We've got about 4 years of data now. And we have all of the information in there to look at things like whether additional PV penetration that exceeds the current utility adoption rules might cause like local voltage variations and that type of thing. In addition, I do quite a bit of work in Africa, so we do a lot of 100% solar sites, so 100% penetration sites in villages in Africa. So we run microgrids or mini grids for developing world villages. Through a company we have spun into CSU called Mesh Power. We run 65 small grids and a couple of larger ones in Rwanda and Uganda, which has been quite interesting. And then the final bit that I work on is in emissions from the natural gas industry. So we do a lot of work on methane emissions that are coming out of pipelines, either as leaks or as combustion byproducts.
Thank you, Dan.
Over to you.
Hi, everybody. My name is Greg Martin. I work at the National Renewable Energy Lab down in Golden. I've been there about 10 years. My background is in electrical engineering. I did some time working with Boeing on the 787 aircraft in Seattle. I came to NREL about, like I said, a little over 10 years ago. And while there, I've worked in initially hydrogen systems. So looking at directly taking wind or solar energy and converting it using water electrolysis into hydrogen. And then what do you do with it? So looking at, trying to understand the engineering challenges, the fundamental technology and science challenges that we still have to overcome to make that affordable, and then serving as a demonstration platform. So from there I kind of moved into more work with microgrids, with intelligent inverters, so power electronics that are now growing at a huge clip across the energy grid. So that's maybe a topic that we touch on is what the impact of power electronics is and what they can do for us and what the challenges are. And I think power electronics would apply to not just renewable energy, but also some of the conventional energy installations. So I don't see the light of day much, like maybe the other two panelists. I spend a lot of time in the lab. I have a team of engineers, and we basically bring in projects and execute projects. Our mission is energy systems integration, so we look at communication technology as it applies to grid technology, so inverter control. We look at how you would set up, design, set up, and then control a microgrid is kind of a good lab scope for us. But then we also have kind of higher powered laboratory technologies using high performance computers to do a lot of modeling. So I think modeling is a really powerful thing, and to answer your question, I'm going to come back to that. So we do also, in addition to traditional modeling, real-time simulation. So we can simulate huge distribution systems, huge distribution feeders at a high level of resolution and do it real time. That allows us to then hook in some of these actual pieces of hardware that you have on your rooftops or in the field and see what those things do when there is an actual grid condition applied to them. We measure that response, we inform controls, system controls from that, and we support partners, mainly utilities, in understanding what the impact of the grid is. So we also, I'll do a little real quick description of the ESIF. So the Energy Systems Integration Facility is the laboratory I work at. And it's a pretty new facility, and it has fundamental science, or like benchtop science, looking at hydrogen technologies, thermal energy storage technologies, sensors, manufacturing processes. So kind of some of the key energy technologies like fuel cells that we're trying to make progress on bringing reliability up and cost down. And then we have a large part of that laboratory that's integration. So we have big electrical distribution buses, both AC and DC. We have fuels, so we have natural gas and diesel, of course. Hydrogen fuel is piped around the laboratory as a usable fuel. We also have thermal energy systems, and that might come up as a interesting topic if we have time. But we combine heat and power either with fuel cells, combustion, or other type, inverter cooling is an interesting topic we look at. Vehicles, of course, everyone, we're pretty worried about helping solve the issue of lots and lots of electric vehicles charging, possibly discharging into the grid. So that's a big part of our testing portfolio as well. I think to answer your question, Pete, I think I'm going to punt on one of them, but I think energy storage and controls are the key things that we have at our disposal that are on a technological advancement pathway right now that brings them into potential use in an affordable way to meet what you guys are trying to do here and what others are trying to do across the globe. The third, I would say, is modeling. And because that is how you can implement things without hitting a wall, without making huge mistakes, without wasting anybody's money to the extent possible. So it's not really a technology that we're going to put on your, deploy, but I think it's really, really key to get it right.
All right, my name is Pat Connors. I'm Vice President of Power Supply for Platte River Power Authority. I'm in charge of the resource planning, operations. I've done transmission planning, resource planning for 30 years. I've spent the first 30 years of my career trying to ramp up generation to match load. I think I'm going to spend the rest of my career trying to figure out how we can change loads to match the generation we have on our portfolio, So I mean, it's going to be a little different thinking, but I think that's kind of how we're thinking about it now. We got to change our mindset a little bit. I'll just touch on like the three I think are the key areas that we think we can get the biggest bang for our buck in terms of what we can do to get more renewables on our system. The first thing is try to get a regional transmission organization implemented here in the West, so we can utilize our transmission system to the maximum extent possible. If we do that, we can then rely on our neighbors who have excess renewables, and when we have excess renewables, we can sell them, and we can load up the transmission system as much as we can, and we think we will need less of the distributed resources that we're going to talk about to try to match our load and our resources. So that's probably the first thing. The second thing is we've got electric vehicles are coming, and we need to figure out how we're going to control those and make sure they don't create, they become an asset, and how we can really benefit the grid and not become a liability. And so we're going to need to, not only are we going to be able to have to control them somewhat, I think pricing is going to have to be a factor in that. We're going to have some kind of market-based pricing so that they're not charging at the wrong times. That's what's going to cause us to have to invest a lot more money in the system and create more use of fossil fuels that we don't want to do. So that's going to be an area. And then just the battery, as we touched on already, that's going to be the third, it's probably the third area where we think has the most potential. And I'll talk a little bit about some of the potential and some of the pitfalls, I'm sure, as we get through some of the questions later on here.
Thanks. And just really quickly for housekeeping, we're going to try to run through the questions here, and then we'll open it up for public Q&A. But if you do have a clarifying question, feel free to throw your hand up if you need to.
Are we loud enough, do you think? Is the volume okay?
Yeah, is everyone hearing fine? Okay. So moving on, what are the main challenges to integrating high levels of renewable energy on the grid?
We're going in order?
I like that in order, that I was gonna go last.
Right, yeah, you get that. Yeah, you be the
Well,
anchor.
we can change, you know.
Yeah, so I think that the problems that we've been looking at are probably in a couple of different spaces. So one of those is sort of local impacts on the distribution system. So the idea there, just kind of roughly, is if you have, you're carrying a lot of load on PV and a cloud comes overhead, sort of ripples through your neighborhood, then you're going to see it go from potentially outflow of power to inflow of power very quickly. And in order for that to happen, there needs to be a change in the voltage level on the distribution system, and that could potentially lead to voltage disturbances locally that could be irritating, okay? Or in some cases could actually cause some serious problems. And so that's one of the larger studies we're looking at. The second one we're looking at is transformer impacts on transformers by PV, right? So in some cases, when you add local generation from PV, you actually end up increasing the aging of your transformers. And at other times, in other load profiles, putting PV on actually decreases the aging of the transformers. And there's kind of a crossover point where even if you're helping the transformer, you go from, at some penetration level, you'll go from decreasing transformer aging to increasing transformer aging. So one of my students, Boover Medva, is actually works on my team and also at the city, has been looking at about 5,000 distribution transformers in Fort Collins network to understand kind of under what conditions increasing PV penetration might cause the transformers to age or not age. So those are kind of the two immediate problems or immediate challenges we've been looking at. I think the third area that we've sort of tabled for now, but we had looked at it before, is under your distribution system has protection settings on it. They cause the breakers to open in a short circuit environment. And so those breaker settings and a lot of the fuse settings in the distribution system are set for power to only flow into loads. And if you start to backfeed the power, you can have situations where you can feed a short and the breakers will not know that the short has occurred, okay? And that's a very dangerous situation because you can have an open circuit or a short circuit without the open circuit or the recloser popping open under some conditions. And so this is kind of a floating issue, and some of my colleagues have been working with off and on at NREL. That's one of the key things. They're building up a new set of typical feeders, and part of the reason for that is so you can start to analyze those types of risk factors. If you're going to go to high penetration, you have to also understand when your protection systems are going to fail.
You took all of mine.
Well, that's the advantage of going first.
That is.
Okay, well, I was just gonna kind of, Dan took mine as well, but I think the key is our biggest challenge is probably figuring out how we're gonna forecast our resources, where, our intermittent resources like wind and solar, what they're gonna be the next 5 minutes, next hour, next few hours, even tomorrow. That's gonna be more of a challenge, more important, and we're gonna have to get better at that. Also our load, we need to get better at, figuring out what our load's gonna be next 5 minutes, next hour, next day as well. And so that's gonna definitely be something we're gonna have to get better at. There's, until we've gotten a lot better, but we're gonna need to get even better at that. Because it's, we're getting really good at predicting, wind and what it's likely to be tomorrow, for every hour. The thing is we're missing is that it's ramping up, it starts ramping up at 8 o'clock instead of 6 o'clock. Which is really a big deal. That's a big difference. And so all of a sudden now you gotta figure out how you're gonna serve that load that the wind didn't ramp up. Solar, as we get more solar and we get more diversified, it's probably gonna be less of an issue, but cloud cover and clouds coming over, we're seeing drop-offs that it's very hard to predict. We only have the one solar project right now up at Rawhide, or the large one. We have all the distributed solar, but that's kind of behind the meter and we don't really see it. So the one we're forecasting is the one up at north of Fort Collins. And so we're doing a better job, but that's still an area that we need to improve a lot in is forecasting. If we're going to be able to, because we're going to have a lot more We got 165 more megawatts of wind coming on next year. Probably some solar, maybe even some solar after that. I'm sure we're going to have more resources, so we're going to have to get better at how we're forecasting. So that's probably our biggest challenge.
How much geographical separation do you need between generation sources in order to get them to be complementary instead of all flowing together?
Yeah, we've looked at it's not so much that it has to be complementary for us, but it needs to be complementary for what is in the region. And that was one of the advantages of the Wyoming wind that we're bringing in next year. It's actually quite complementary to the other wind that's in Colorado, particularly the wind that's east of Denver. So that's actually it's very complementary to that. And wind and solar are very complementary. I mean, so that works well. And so that means you have to rely on these distributed resources less and less as you get more of these complementary resources. But even as you get more and more of them that are complementary, there still are times when you don't have enough of them. And so you're going to have to figure out other ways to serve that load during those times.
So moving on to low-hanging fruit, which I'll start with Greg. What are sort of the low-hanging fruits of technologies that we can apply, roll out pretty quickly to help address some of these challenges?
I should have tried to answer the last one. There is also, you're calling the questions from, okay. So I think I want to go back, I think a lead-in could start from the last question. So I want to kind of build off of what I heard just stated, in that protection is a challenge. So we don't have devices necessarily in all cases that we can readily pull off the shelf and put in that are going to work right for us. That's changing. I think Europe is leading the way in a lot of these kind of circuit protection devices that may find their way into the market and in an affordable way, I think, once things start to take off. So that is a challenge. Inertia is a challenge. We all have an idea of what inertia is. As it applies to the electricity grid, it's an issue that has to do with protection, and it's an issue that also has to do with more power electronics being the sources or loads on the grid, constant power loads. So the problem is that no longer do we have a huge rotating machine that's directly connected to the three-phase AC power system, which when you go downstream and you short circuit those two wires together, that machine's got so much rotating inertia, it just dumps current, and that current pulse allows us to protect that short circuit. Power electronics, you have a multi-megawatt PV plant. Those things are so fast, and they have the intelligence and controls built in that if they see a short circuit, their current's going to start shooting up. It's going to say, that ain't right, cut it off. Our protection never tripped. So now, a system operator doesn't have the necessarily processes in place to address something like that. So we need to rethink kind of the protection and the bidirectional aspects. I think to go to low-hanging fruit, the low-hanging fruit is probably voltage regulation. Just using these power electronics inverters on PV, on batteries, on wind, on natural gas machines, if those are in the mix as we kind of take this process to stabilize our grid to the extent possible. So you can use some relatively known and low-cost control methodologies to provide imaginary power. I'm sure we all love to talk about that. To support the grid, to keep our voltage stable. So instead of needing a big machine to do that, you can do that with power electronics with a really low-cost device that's always ready to do that. So I think that's something that we use to kind of help up the penetration a little bit as we have distributed rooftop solar, as we have these community solar at the kind of grid edge. You can also do some interesting ancillary services using large plants. Of course, batteries are awesome because they're bidirectional. Now you can start to do frequency regulation, which is another big issue that we need to watch when we're building out these big renewable energy systems. So I think, you know, the voltage and frequency control, making sure it's understood how that plays in with the kind of bulk grid droop situation, so that utilities have another knob to turn to make sure that grid stays stable. I'd say that's kind of low-hanging fruit. And LED light bulbs are good. You know, demand management, anytime we start talking about investing, the best thing to do first is reduce the amount of energy you need. If you can find a way to have appliances that are affordable, that provide value to the system and the community overall, that's, to me, low-hanging fruit that we can all participate in, play our part in. That's really important. And, you know, if we have kind of a mindset and an approach that allows, you know, a little flexibility on the customer side, and, you know, we can start to now overlay these grid edge intelligent devices with the next layer of distribution systems that can leverage those types of grid edge functions. I guess that might be the next step in the process to start thinking about.
I mean, if there was low-hanging fruit, I mean, I think we would, my smart aleck answer is we would all be trying, we'd be doing it already. There's not, I mean, a lot of easy things that we think we can just grab and do. There's a couple things that I think where we can spend some resources, and I think there's some real potential, and that is in, you know, smart meters or smart thermostats. I mean, I read a report recently that there's 15% of the households in the US have smart thermostats already. It's probably greater in this area. I wouldn't be surprised if we get closer to 50%. But I think there's a real opportunity there to get those under some control, where we can actually get customers to say, you know, I want low comfort or medium comfort, or they're willing to have some variability in their comfort level for some value. And I think there's some opportunity there where we could really help, you know, control some of our load that way, if we could get those under control. Not easy. We know where they probably are, but, you know, we don't know how and there's capability to access them, but to get customers to sign up and to do it is going to be I think the challenge going forward. It's low hanging. I think EVs we got to get on top of sooner rather than later. We got to be able to do make sure we can control that load so it doesn't become a liability on our system. And I think it's actually a way to make the system more reliable if we do it right. So I think those are, in my area, are kind of the two areas we're trying to focus on. You know, where can we try to get real value? I'm not saying it's low-hanging fruit either, though, but I'm just saying it's
Relatively.
okay.
Low-hanging if you're 7 foot.
As far as using the various sources of energy, such as wind and solar and things like that, to work together, some complementariness to balance out the load versus the use. The thing we've talked about for decades, it seems like, is the role of storage. How can you use the storage of energy? How can you store the energy? That's one question, of course. And we talked about batteries, and we talked about pump storage and lots of things like that. Is there anything happening in the storage area that would help with the compatibility and complementary aspects of the energy usage it can be? Is that an area of concentrated work now in the storage area? And if so, what is it? How does it handle on these other problems?
I think we can jump into storage because that's a big part of it. Anyone want to kick off? Dan?
Yeah, so I'm an accidental academic, right? So I spent most of my time in industry, and then I, through a series of accidents, ended up at CSU pretending to be a research scientist. And so my experience in industry has always been that when you see an industry go into manufacturing economies of scale, it's actually quite remarkable what things can do in terms of driving prices down, driving reliability up, and that type of thing. And I think where we are with batteries right now is we're kind of right in that scale thing where people are really trying different approaches, different sort of configurations of batteries that are more manufacturable and can scale up. And so I think we're going to see continuous movement on there, but I don't think the bottom's going to drop out of the price or anything, but I think that you'll see kind of steady improvement. As an example, and this is a little bit off the point, but it's kind of an example of what manufacturing scale was when I was at Hewlett Packard, when the LCD screens were about this big, and everybody was saying that it would be impossible to scale them any larger. I happened to be in Korea buying granite blocks for X-ray machines. That's another story. But in the room, there was a granite block about the size of the space between the front two tables that they were machining. And I asked the vendor what they were doing. He says, well, that's the manufacturing platform for the next generation of LCDs. Okay, when they were going to start doing them on 12, basically 4 meter by 4 meter size platforms with, a few billions of transistors on each one, right? And I think we're kind of at the same role right now where they're talking about battery plants are starting changing the way they're doing the batteries and the way they're manufacturing. And I think we're going to see continuous movement in that space.
It's incremental improvements, as Dan talked about. I mean, we've heard that maybe in 5 years we'll see batteries 30% cheaper than they are today. People weigh in if they, on their estimates, but we don't know where it's going to be. It's probably going to be cheaper, but we need tenfold decrease in prices to really make a significant penetration on the solar, on the battery side, if we're going to try to integrate all these renewables. We can't just see incremental improvement. We got to see significant improvement.
But is battery even your method of choice for storage, or would you talk about some of the other things that you were just talking about for other means of large storage, right?
Well,
batteries are great for quick, fast.
I mean, I think there's other options, like pump storage, but I think it's going to be extremely hard to get that permitted and get something built like that in the next 10 years. That's a long-term project, many millions of dollars of capital at risk before you could get something like that. And that's even if you can find a really compatible site for it. So I think it's something we should really continue to look at. It's probably got to be done more on a grander scale, where multiple utilities. It's not just one, Platte River doing it. It's a consortium of utilities trying to do something like that. I think in the end, it's ultimately going to be a little bit of everything. A lot of things that are going to be needed. Like I've said, we got to have resources, load we can control. We got to have new resources that we can control. The more you have all of these resources working together, the less you need of the storage. And I think that's ultimately going to have to be the answer based on where the storage prices are today.
So, storage can benefit the grid right now. If all you have is a coal plant and a nuclear plant, storage is becoming, with batteries, a value proposition. Things like pumped hydro, of course, if it's permitted. And I did some academic work in pumped hydroelectric, and I think that the thing I learned is that we need to be creative, and I think there's a lot of potential innovation staring at us right now, where we have an interesting opportunity right now to define what we could do for energy storage. It doesn't have to be batteries. The reason that we have batteries for the grid is the reason. And those vehicles that use batteries. Not because batteries are the best solution for the grid. So, if you have an aquifer that's 300 feet below surface and you have a agricultural organization or a farm that has a surface pond, you have potential energy between your surface pond and the aquifer. So there's energy right there. There's this crazy idea that I got some venture capitalists emailing out funding opportunities from this company in Britain that had a granite mine or some kind of hard rock mine, and they were going to solution mine this 1 mile by 1 mile slab of rock and then get that thing free and then just pump water in underneath it and raise it up 3 feet. And that's they calculated it was some crazy amount of megawatt, almost a gigawatt hour. And then when they need the energy, just let it squeeze that water out. I mean, there's serious engineering challenges with that. But I can't tell you the amount of times I've tried to calculate, okay, if I have a hole in the ground and I have a really heavy something, how much energy do I have if I raise and lower that? So, maybe a community can get really creative and say, we've got this weird, geological formation that we want to make into our energy storage, or we've got this, I don't want to, start any controversy about how we use land and recreation and, what wilderness. I think that's extremely important. So it's a tough thing. Pumped hydro is a tough thing. But I mean, I guess I'd encourage people to get creative. I think a long-term thing to really watch is hydrogen. I think hydrogen is going to be start becoming a viable thing. It's not cost-effective at this point, and I know how important that is. But you can make fertilizer out of hydrogen. You can make livestock feed out of hydrogen without using a major input of fossil fuels or any input of fossil fuels. You can fuel vehicles with hydrogen. You can store energy with hydrogen technologies. Back to the battery thing, or energy storage thing, there's talk about controlling a wide swath of devices, including solar and power electronics, to act like batteries. So that starts to break down as well when you start having big penetration. And penetration is, I wanted to also bring this up, penetration is an interesting thing, and we have to kind of watch how we think about it, because once you get to 50%, you can't, it's not penetration anymore. That's your system. It's not like 60% penetration. We have to figure out how to control these things, and transmission is something that we're gonna have to look at. And there's more value propositions for if you have a good resource of renewable energy in an area to work with system operators and power providers to optimize use of transmission and distribution. And I think there's value on both sides there too.
So besides from storage, are there any other emerging technologies? Definitely not low-hanging fruit, things that you're seeing on the horizon or fairly close that you think are going to be kind of game changers in the long term?
Well, I mean, there's distributed energy resource management systems, that are trying to get all of these devices out there, like smart thermostats and things to work together. But right now the problem is they're not plug and play. There's not a single platform that everything's compatible with. And so there needs to be more, standards and other things to get these things to work so that we can scale. Right now, everyone's different. Every system we look at, we got to get a new interface with that. We can't get it all working together. So I think there's potential. There's a lot of potential. There's a lot of controllable load out there. It's just trying to figure out how we can get access to it and control it in a cost-effective way. We can't have 10, 20, or 50 different systems. We got to have one or two systems to make this work.
So I think that there's a perennial problem, I think, with this, is that everybody's looking for this sort of miracle solution to show up. And it's really a system engineering problem, and the system includes sociological factors and political factors. And so I think that we shouldn't be thinking that some magic emergent technology is going to solve this problem. Okay, so the problem is going to be solved by this combination of socio-political decisions plus kind of steady slogging through systems integration and system improvement, I think. I think actually that's probably the emerging technology, really. So.
Yeah, I think controls, with information technologies and communication and networking technologies there is some potential to start to leverage controls like DERMS, microgrid controllers, advanced distribution management systems to have a more intelligent approach to managing energy and help us improve efficiency, which makes, bringing new technologies into the mix more cost effective.
You spoke very briefly about a real-time market. Seems to me that if a real-time market were engineered appropriately geographically, and the communications technology were focused on taking from the real time and delivering to the real time, you would actually end up with a pretty standardized system. And it seems to me that that would support what you're looking for here, including battery storage, would be essentially the marketplace itself. You would have a tremendous advantage, and it would be very cost effective if it were spread out geographically, so like east to west, to take advantage of photovoltaics over a large space.
So let's go ahead, because that was one of the questions, so
Oh.
I'll just sort of jump into it. That's okay, I didn't want to cut you off. So, what are the roles that, both markets on the regional level and potentially, a national market, how much can that help absorb, especially when we talk about utility scale moving around, not so much on the distribution level?
First of all, just on the markets, about 2/3 of the U.S. is covered in a market today. Southeast is not U.S. Everything, it's the Western Interconnect, but it's South Dakota, kind of Wyoming border, just straight south, except for California. They are in a market. So everything in the West is not in a market. We've been trying very hard at Platte River to get a market going. We were very close last year when Piesco pulled out of it, and we had something that we thought was really close, and we could get approval at FERC, but we didn't quite make it.
Why?
I don't know why Piesco why they pulled out eventually. Ultimately, you'd have to ask them, but they ultimately said it wasn't in their interest at this point. I think everyone knows we need a market here in the West. I think it'll happen. It's just a matter of when it happens. Is it going to be another 2 years, 5 years, 10 years? I think everyone knows. There's just a lot of different interests that everyone has, and it's hard to get a compromise and get everyone on the same page. But eventually, as mandates for renewables go up, I think we'll get there. But I just don't know how long it's going to take.
So it's sociological and political.
It's everything.
Would you say that Texas energy market is a good example?
Yeah, that's an energy market as well. Texas is a market. Is in a market. They have an energy market.
Well, is this something to emulate?
Is it something to emulate? I think they're all fine. All of them have their attributes. They're all a little different, and they all have kind of seams problems to try to go across. So you want the bigger the better. And so we don't want small markets. We want as large a market as we possibly can. Because definitely the seams becomes an issue in trying to do, and because you want the diversity. We would like to get some of the California solar later in the day when they still have sun and get it over here. That would make our storage problems and our problems less here. And if we had that diversity among the larger markets.
Do we have the technology to cross those seams?
And again, it's this bunch of political and
Systems engineering?
yeah, there's a lot of issues why they can't solve. They can solve those seams issues, but everyone has their own little system they like. They think it's better than the neighbor system, and everyone wants to work together. Everyone says they're working together, but it's hard. There's a lot. It's just you got two different systems running at two different times, and then you're trying to match up pricing and flows across them. It's never a great solution. They figure out band-aids and they figure out ways to improve it, but it's never, it's not perfect. It's not as good as having a single market.
There's a potential for a more distributed market, maybe, And maybe people have heard stories about like a blockchain or a transactive energy environment where really anybody could participate, as the concept goes. It's kind of like a, software, ledger-based software that looks like what banks use maybe for financial transactions, but applied to energy transactions. So if I have some kind of asset or resource that I want to have participate in the market to see if I can make money off of it, how can I make that happen? So it's kind of taking the concept of a residential power purchase agreement to a much different level, and to say that if I can find somebody else out there that wants to wheel energy with me, maybe there's a neighbor 10 doors down that has a battery, I've got solar, let's work together, we can provide energy to some market that's providing price signals. I don't know where that could go. There's certainly research interest in that, and there's certainly some potential. The computing power and how that would all work, and what the impact of the utility is now, because now you have more of a free market at the edge using infrastructure that's not necessarily owned by everyone who's connected to it and needs to be managed. So there's a lot of challenges there, but
It's integration.
It's integration.
We ultimately need pricing, down at the distribution level too. I mean, some places on the distribution system is a great place to put a battery or solar. In other places, it's not as good because of some of the stuff that Dan talked about, that the transformers may be already overloaded. It needs to be more pricing. I think more granular pricing, on even at the local levels, on where we should put this stuff.
Is Platte River looking at real-time pricing?
Well, we'd have to get a market first before we can even think about trying to get to real-time pricing. I mean, we kind of have a joint dispatch agreement with 3 other utilities that we implement, and we kind of have a mini market, but it's not a full market that I feel comfortable that it's the right price. It gives us a signal that when wind blows and solar is pretty heavy, prices are low, and when it's not, prices are higher. I mean, it gives us that kind of granularity, and so we know that there's an effect going on with the wind and the solar, but it's not what I would say a full market.
Can I come back to something you mentioned earlier in terms of the market and the utility level distribution system, so transmission systems? Is there a trade-off between transmissions and storage, in that we could, if we put in more transmission lines, we could reduce our storage? And is this something that could happen in the future? I mean, obviously, building transmission lines is one of the hardest political problems we could solve. But from a technical point of view, it's not that tough.
Yeah, I mean, that's why I'm saying if you build more transmission, more interstate transmission where you could actually rely on neighbors, yeah, you would need less storage because you could rely on your neighbors because their sun is setting an hour later. Clearly there would be a benefit, but that comes with a cost as well. Transmission is not cheap, but we have seen that it looks cost effective to do it, but it's hard politically to build it and get the additional transmission built too.
So I'd like to address a different part of the market issue. So one of the things that we've been thinking about and doing some work on with some other universities is sort of social equity issues around renewable energy. Because a lot of the ways that we're paying for it now with net metering, ways we're encouraging people to implement things, are not very evenly spread. The opportunity is not spread to apartment dwellers, to lower income people, folks who live in higher density housing, which we would generally like to see, okay, is not as easy to do it. And so there are a whole host of sort of capital market issues that have to do with social equity around the way we're doing distributed solar, distributed other energy, and when we do storage, distributed storage. I happen to be the proud owner of 2 electric vehicles. I can afford them, and I got a huge amount of all of your tax money for doing it. Okay, so I think we need to be kind of cognizant of the other part of the market, which is sort of how it works across the entire population, and how the entire population participates in that transaction.
So moving along, trying to jump right back into what's the best question to go to. In terms of what we see happening around the country and around the world, there are some really, examples that really stand out to you all in terms of where people are really pushing the envelope and kind of getting it done and not really running into a wall, at least yet?
I don't ever get out of the lab. Germany?
Yeah, I know Germany has done a lot, but I see that, they're starting to have issues as well with too much solar coming on at the wrong times. So, I think everyone's trying to solve this problem. I don't think anyone has solved it yet. We're all trying to figure this out. If someone did, they would.
Would be packaging and selling it?
Yeah, then we'd be buying it. But I can't think of anything right offhand that gives me any comfort that we're any further ahead or any further behind than most of the rest of the world.
I think that there's some interesting thinking going on. So I'll give one example, and this is dated, so it's 2 years old, 3 years old. Ireland has very high wind penetration. They, like most grid operators, were trying very, very hard to keep their frequency locked at 50 hertz. There's the reason we do that is historical. Frequency is not as, the variation in frequencies are not as big a deal as they used to be. And so they were actually experimenting with opening their frequency limits and allowing the frequency to drift more. And it turns out that unloads a lot of control actions that are expensive. Okay, so I think that in different areas where they've been sort of they've come up against isolated problems, or they're more isolated grids, they've had to start thinking about some, creatively about some ways of approaching the problem.
You spoke earlier about modeling and getting better at doing that. But anyone who's done modeling knows that it's the outliers that are expensive, and that there's an increasing marginal cost to handle these outliers.
Yeah.
And so one of the big problems we have even with very good modeling is that unless we have customers who are willing to say, oh, well, today I won't have electricity, I won't use my electrical services, it costs exponentially more expensive to handle them. And that's a problem that people don't realize when they talk about marginal costs of storage or of generation or whatever else. It's handling these outliers that become very, very, very expensive.
There's a lot of very wet people in Nebraska right now thinking about outliers. And so when we're looking at distribution model, we're primarily looking at rare event studies. So most of the work I do is on stochastic modeling, and really that's the whole fun part. Whether you're doing it for a village or you're doing it for a local community, it's the how many nines do you want, okay, and at what probability do you want those nines to be true, which is a slightly different question. Okay, smiling, okay, and so so I think that is a big issue, and so your ability to trade off some reliability or some convenience factors or something like that, that's a socio-political question, that we kind of know how we model it. How people would adopt it's another question.
Yeah, and modeling, there's lots of different goals, right? Economics, power quality, stability. Even we can start to look at vulnerability based on modeling, and all of that potentially falls under the moniker that's coming out of resiliency, which that's a very broad term, I believe. So yes, there's gonna be growing pains as we kind of, advance technology and we try to, change the engine on this semi that we're barreling down the highway in, which is the most complex machine, by the way, that really man has ever come up with, the electrical grid. To make it resilient is to try to accommodate outliers as well as, large, low probability catastrophic and day-to-day just, let's keep the lights on. So that's a very big challenge, and that again, modeling is key, and then new technologies and new ways of thinking, like opening up the standards for frequency can help keep your system running a lot longer, or having these new algorithms in power electronics that have some kind of intelligence, so they see what the grid, that line they're connected to, is doing, and they can infer what they should do based on that. And that's kind of a resilient way of, to me, thinking of things, because you don't need a control line from some central controller to tell that thing what to do. It just does some job. And yeah, you can probably imagine the mathematical complexity that scholars want to get into and start modeling this stuff with, but there might be some real benefit to that.
Messing with the frequency gives me a lot of concern on reliability. Everyone is willing to say they're willing to take an outage until they have an outage, and it's not as fun. I was out electricity the other day, and it wasn't even a storm for like 5 hours, and my wife's like, well, I can't use this, I can't do that, and so I think we were gotten really dependent on having reliable electricity, and that's one of our highest priorities at Platte River.
You talk about unlocking the frequency, what about unlocking the voltage, right? And a lot of electronics today, you can plug it into 110, you can plug it into 220, a lot of devices could be designed to not require, such a precise voltage.
So just to be clear, I'm not sure if Ireland ever did,
No,
I know they were looking at it, but I don't know if they ever
They
did.
require the frequency to stay a certain.
One of our members,
Voltage are far more flexible.
one of our members is lowering their voltage on their distribution feeders to save, you do save a little bit of electricity.
They've been doing that for decades.
Yeah, it's been going on. It's just, it's 1 or 2%. It's not 10.
Hopefully,
And kind of speaking to that, that addresses a bundle of these issues, and notably frequency, okay, DC microgrids, as a way to buffer some of those issues. Why are we still using AC? Sorry.
I'll get first on the microgrids. I mean, we obviously support, any microgrids, and for more, if, customers want higher reliability. We want to provide high reliability to everyone. And microgrids are expensive. I mean, it's expensive to maintain, expensive to put in place. And it can be, and it's a good option for some customers who need really high reliability. We just don't know if we want to start implementing these across the board, and I don't think everyone needs them, because I think it's going to add costs without significant overall benefits, because our reliability with our customers is already extremely high. And yes, it would get us to 5 nines on reliability instead of 4 nines, but we're already have a fairly reliable system.
Charlie?
So in the opening remarks, two of you mentioned quite a bit of concern about electric cars and what it would do to the grid. We haven't come back to that since then.
I have a question, shall we? So, what are the challenges and opportunities of EVs and vehicle-to-grid control?
there are challenges and opportunities.
That's exactly right.
Is that final?
What is?
I mean, yeah, so it's energy storage, potentially. I think the big challenge to kind of capture the problem on a 40,000 foot level, so to speak, is we have a couple of energy systems right now, electricity grid and fuels, like, hydrocarbon liquid fuels or gaseous. And they're pretty much separate for transportation and electricity. And you know, of course, this is putting us down on the path of combining the two. And adding in, imagine how much energy we spend for transportation. Add that capacity and energy or power onto the electrical grid, the way it stands right now. That's a challenge, right? There needs to be controls that make sure the grid doesn't break. There needs to probably be some kind of buffering, and you know, here we go back to talking about potentially energy storage at vehicle fueling, vehicle charging places to buffer it, and then that's nice because now I can provide grid services and I can help regulate frequency potentially. The geographical distribution of transportation use and if we can do vehicle to grid, how does that kind of time variance smoothed out over a wide area give us, you know, benefit too? There's a lot of, you know, modeling and simulation questions that we are actually starting to look at NREL on a big scale, like Denver metro area with scenarios for charging lots and lots of vehicles and fleets at high power levels. So it's tough to say where that vehicle market's going to take us, because I guess my concern would be, okay, all of a sudden we decide we're going to put in lots and lots of 200 or 300 kilowatt fast chargers so people can fuel their Porsche, I guess. I don't know of any other fast charge vehicles right now on the market in 5 minutes. And once we get a lot of those, all of a sudden, okay, the transformers are overheating, power quality's a mess, we have frequency going crazy, and that the cost of that goes way up then if we haven't designed our system to accommodate that. And that pushes charging back to kind of where we're at now at more of a distributed lower power level. So I think if we're going to be able to, I don't know exactly what we're going to be able to do in the near term, because vehicle to grid is something that gets into people's behavior. So it's really hard for us to model it. It's really hard for us to analyze it and to design a system based on what we think people might do.
How is it straining? Is it potentially going to strain fleets? Now or how soon?
Yeah, it's not yet,
Not yet.
but it's going to if we don't control it.
Yeah.
At what EV, with our current infrastructure, at what EV penetration, or at what EV adoption rate is this becoming an issue?
I don't know right offhand. I've
I
seen.
mean, it's obviously
You know,
precise.
it's a lot higher, I mean, than it is today. I mean, we gotta get, you know, probably to the 20–30% penetration level. We're in the, you know, single digits, 1–2% now. So we, you know, but it also depends on where it's located. If it's everyone's on the same distribution feeder, it's gonna be a problem. And it's gonna be a lot sooner. But generally, we can probably handle quite a bit more before it becomes a problem. You know, but from my perspective, you know, where the issue is, you know, I think we can control it pretty well with price, with controls on when they charge, and we can manage it. It's the, you know, when, you know, are they ever gonna want to let us use it as a battery and benefit the grid by discharging their batteries from their car? I don't think many car companies that own an expensive car are gonna wanna do that, because they're not gonna trust us that we're gonna have it depleted, and then when they wanna leave in the morning, there's no juice for them. So I think there's a lot more protections and a lot more controls that need to be in place before that happens in a grand scale.
So we read a bunch of studies a few years back on vehicle to grid and controlled charging. And controlled charging, you know, controls always have lots of problems, but and there's lots of challenges to actually making it work really well. But controlled charging, it makes a lot of sense, and it's sort of it's not maybe necessarily low-hanging fruit because there's not enough fruit on the tree. There's not enough cars out there now. But controlled charging is actually fairly straightforward, and it's pretty valuable, and you can make it work pretty well. Vehicle to grid, going the back the other way, is one of those things that really looks nice technically until you actually get like real people and real systems involved and you start looking at it. And then it goes south really quickly because you've got three parties involved: the car company, the car owner, and the utility. And only one of those cares about vehicle to grid, the utility, and they don't want to pay very much. And the other two have an expensive asset, and they don't really see much value in the utility part, right? And so my guess is if we went back and looked at it today, 5 years later, we would see the same thing. It's still, vehicle to grid is a dodgy affair, and I don't think it's going
I
to come back.
just wanted to add here, I heard Kevin Harrison from NREL, from the hydrogen group, on that subject a couple of weeks ago, and he said this whole vehicle to grid thing is a tiny, tiny sliver when it comes to trying to modulate the excess power that's already being produced by renewables in California. That's the market they looked at. Tiny sliver.
Are you guys familiar with like ABB and Ballast project? They're going for thousands of vehicles in a virtual power plant working together. The National Utility of Norway is launching a multi-gigawatt-hour virtual power plant in the UK based on electric vehicles connected together in a virtual power plant. A number of other vendors are claiming that their software is ready to go to be able to do just that. Have you seen any of those technologies or know the vendors?
I'm aware of these projects, I don't know much about them. You know, I don't know if I am in a position to comment on the readiness of these offerings. But
They're deploying right now.
Yeah.
There's thousands of cars already connected in a single battery system.
virtual power plant is a potentially powerful thing. I think, you know, you need willing participants, I would assume. I don't know where the vehicles are coming from and things, but yeah, again, vehicles are energy storage. Energy storage is a key.
Can you speak a little louder?
Sorry.
It's really low.
Well, we might just,
We can't hear the questions that are asked up there.
okay.
Yeah. Okay.
So I'm gonna just sort of reframe, and, you know, speaking of that, we get back to kind of the social issues, you know, and kind of, you know, what sort of tools exist for that kind of more granular demand side, not just management, but sort of communication and prompts, pricing, things to get consumers, because there is a social issue. If you're in Norway, probably they might be more receptive to it versus here in the States. Broad question, but I think consumer behavior really is a huge part. And what can we do to guide and or control it in a way that's acceptable?
You know, we think a little bit, we've been trying to think about what are we gonna need to do. And I think we gotta, I guess my view is we gotta make it simple. We can't have a complicated, you know, thing for customers and consumers to decide what, you know, they can't give them 10 choices. We gotta give them, you know, high comfort, medium comfort, low comfort, you know, settings. And we'll let us control it, and if it's not to the right comfort level, you can, you know, pop it up to a different level of comfort that you're looking for. I mean, I think we gotta think in simple terms to make it, you know, usable. And you know, this group here is very engaged and really understands it, but that's not the average person out there. They think about electricity about 2 seconds a year. Not
When they do their bill.
when they send their bill, right?
I wonder what the, you know, trends will be, because I think there's, you know, depending on where you are in the country, there's some interesting thought about the use case for transportation in general. Meaning, why should I own a vehicle? And I know that, you know, it's a big part of our kind of American culture. But I think there's also, you know, a culture in this country that, you know, maybe our younger people are less interested in owning the vehicle, and they're more interested in connectivity and access, and you know, they're just as happy to have the time to use their, you know, connected device as they are to drive around. And so maybe hailing, dare I say, autonomous vehicles rather than owning one is a model that could start to contribute to higher levels of management possibilities for, you know, utilities using them as an asset, working with some kind of aggregator or transportation provider. So that's probably years out. I don't know if that's pertinent to this.
So I would comment on the people involvement part. So I happen to work with a number of folks in sociology and psychology here who go out and study how people react to things like energy monitors that you can have in your house. And I'd say the results are pretty dismal, okay, just generally speaking. So I think that the idea that people are going to suddenly want to be playing around in a market for electricity is probably not their top priority. And certainly a lot of the engagement things that people thought us geeks think would be kind of cool to have don't play very well in Peoria, so to speak. So people will use this stuff for very short periods of time. It then drops off. They don't interact with it. One of my favorites in that front was the people who are running the smart thermostat program here in Fort Collins. And I can't remember the exact numbers, but a very large fraction of those thermostats have no program in them. Okay, they've never been programmed. They're just at a fixed temperature all the time. Okay, and those are pretty easy to program because you can get on your app on your phone or on your computer and program. It's like a third of them or something like that are not programmed. And so I think that if we're going to get that kind of participation, it's going to have to be smarter appliances than our current smart appliances.
Actually, if I can just comment on that. So I 100% agree with you that I think people are not going to pay any attention to this.
Yeah.
Right? Market signals that you send to people in their house are going to be ignored. But maybe, somebody is going to Nest or Ring or whoever it is going to be by that time is going to pay attention. And they're going to pay attention to those market signals and they're going to do it for you. So yes, maybe consumers don't care, but the devices the consumers buy might care.
Maybe.
I'm not sure this is true because I heard about France that they have very harsh time of use rates, and price is a very capable modifier of people's behavior. I mean, you pay through the roof if you run your appliances at the wrong time of day, and people learn from high bills.
Carol?
Yeah, and I'm with you. We play around with the idea of dashboards, and nobody cares except us nerds in this room. I was just going to bring the question back to the whole 100% renewable energy and bring it back to the local goals that we all have. And I think Tim McCullough told me once that something like 20% of the electric load in Fort Collins is related to commercial customers, both corporate and local, that have made 100% renewable electricity goals, something 15-20%, some significant number. What role do those of us that are large customers in town have to play to help the city and Platte River and utility reach those goals?
Looking to me?
It's social, it's political, it's all those things. Yeah.
First way I would say is, we're trying to do as much as we can. And if some, whatever that number is, 60%, 80%, whatever, 90%, whatever we can get to, we're going to do as much as we can. If some customer is saying they're 100% and we're allocating them more, we have that, we can only go as far as we can go. And we're basically dividing up the 80% so that the rest of the customers are going to get less. So you can say a corporate customer wants to be 100%, and that's great, but we can still only do 80% on the total system, whatever that number is. I don't know what that number is. I'm just throwing out a number. And so,
but your goal is 100%.
And maybe we'll get to it. Our goal is 100% if we meet all the caveats. And one of them is reliability, and one of them is financially sustainable. Another one is, so we have to, we're going to do that. We're striving to do it. But, chances are we're not going to get to 100%, in the next 5 years. And we're going to try to get there in 10 years. So we have to be realistic about how we're, if customers want it, someone else is going to get less. Because we're only going to be able to do so much at any one time. Maybe we'll get to 100%, but that's still at least 10 years away.
So we have no role to play in this, is what you're telling me?
I think we can try to, if people want to do it, I don't want them to, I don't want the other customers to be penalized for it. That's all I'm saying. And then I think there's ways to do it, but we need to talk about it, we need to work with the local utilities to be able to figure out a way to do that. There are ways to do it.
So I've heard you guys talk a lot about kind of the nerdy side of all of us kind of being super interested in all this. And I understand where you're coming from with a lot of the different details that you're talking about. But I think one thing, as like a younger person that I've noticed very frequently through every single aspect of this field is that many of us don't talk about it and don't share our passions with the people close to us, either in proximity or relations. Like, I've literally gotten my roommates and showed them how to use a wattage meter, just to show them kind of, things like vampiric draw, how much this little thing, eats up per minute. And little things like that to really get a sense of what's going on. But I go to a local utility panel and it lasts an hour long. And there's a line of people still wanting to ask questions because they don't understand. And just like y'all were saying, there's a really big gap in knowledge. And I don't think that's anything to blame anyone for. We've moved massively in the past few decades, and to expect people to just get it is ridiculous to me. I think resoundingly we need to do a better job of explaining things and making time to explain those things to people, especially customers in the grid.
Actually, Kevin.
Yeah, I'd just like to come back a little bit to Carol's question and the response from our colleague from PRPA, because first of all, I'm worried because PRPA is committed to the 100% goal. Yes, there are caveats. The 4 cities that own PRPA have set those goals. So what I'm hearing is a lot of hedging on that in terms of, could we get to 60, 80, maybe 100. So that's a concern because that is a goal that has been set by the owners of PRPA and by the board of PRPA. So that's one issue. But then on the question of what the big customers can do, it seems like there's a lot. I mean, if their usage is high, there's a lot that they could do in terms of demand management, in terms of distributed resource generation and storage or other things. So I think there's going to have to be a lot of involvement by the cities that are owners, by the biggest users of power, for PRPA to be able to, do its part as well. So just like to hear a little bit more about that, because these goals have been set, and that's the expectation of the communities. And we realize it's not so easy. There will be technical challenges. There will be financial challenges, but those are the goals, and we've got 11 years to get there.
And I'm not disagreeing with your premise, that we got to work with our large customers, we got to work with all of our customers to get them to help us get to 100%. It's going to take all of us. Not one of us, can do this alone. So we do that. I'm just referring to, some of those customers want to be 100% tomorrow, or next year. We're not going to be 100% next year, but yet they want to have a corporate goal to be 100% in the next year or two.
And I think what you're saying, and they're not locally.
And they're not locally.
They're
right.
buying renewable
Yeah.
power that's, from
What's
the utility.
happened to the discussion about green tariffs? And I know there's a lot of work being done on the rate structures, but that was something that was discussed, so that, and in fact, Fort Collins Utilities has a program where if you want to pay a premium for 100% renewable, you can do that. So are those kind of green tariffs and those kind of rate structures something that's under active consideration right now?
I mean, the green tariffs are the local utilities,
Right.
whatever they want to implement and however they want to divide up. We generate so much renewables, every member gets their load ratio share of whatever we produce. How they divvy it out and give it to their customers, that's really a local utility decision, and it's really their decision on how they do that. And we just want to make sure that, everyone knows what they're getting, and we're just trying to do as much as we can. I mean, to be honest, we're looking at more. We're looking at things where what we can do and how we can do more. but we can't do it all. We can't do it all in 1 or 2 years.
So, yeah. So I think one of the ways that we've been doing it is I think maybe a little bit more tactical. You sort of look at, well, what's the next problem that you're hitting, and then, you know, maybe a problem or two that you can anticipate that are high probability. You work through those, and you get to the next one, and the next one, and the next one. I mean, that's kind of system engineering in the short description. And so so I'll give you an example of one of those, is that to date, there are typically no operational models that say this feeder could be at 50% renewables with no problem. I'm not talking about frequency or anything like that, just voltage problems. This one is a problem at 15%. We don't really know that right now in any kind of labor effective way, right? And so as a result, if you're a large warehouse owner, or you have a parking garage in the middle of town, Carol, or something like that, and you want to put PV across the top of it, the first thing that's going to happen is you go to the utility and say, I want to drop 100 kilowatts on this feeder, and they're going to say, well, you know, that's over our magic limit, okay? And so we need to go back and do a much larger analysis. And so like one of the next problems that we need to figure out is how do you quickly evaluate whether a particular feeder is fragile, or challenged, or it has challenged equipment on it, or whether this one can just kind of like keep dumping stuff on it, it's no problem. Okay, and then I think you kind of go to the next one. So now we're seeing a load spike at 9 p.m. Okay, why? Because a bunch of us have electric cars, and they're all programmed to start charging at 9 p.m. because we have time of use rates. In a couple of months, they'll all start at a different time of day, okay? Because we'll all reprogram our cars. Okay, so I think that we need to kind of look at the problem. What I would suggest is we need to look at the problem that way. We need to just sort of like, well, why isn't every big box store in town covered with solar panels? Okay, well, problem A, B, C. How do we address those problems? Go to the next one, go to the next one, go to the next one. Now, I'm doing that from a distribution perspective because I'm sort of a distribution guy. I don't work on the transmission system. But I think that's sort of the natural way we can make this happen.
So that's a great question. Why, you know, would the utilities be able to advertise, you know, and say, these are the places that are actually the most beneficial to the utility to put solar here, you know, and that we would want to encourage those solar installations, right? They're high ROI, they're the low-hanging fruit that you talked about, but we can quite answer.
And besides the social equity issues on that one,
Well, I mean,
right? But there are, yeah, I mean, you could potentially come up and say, well, you know, here's a place where we could really go great guns, and here's an area of town where we need to be cautious.
Most of us don't really care whose roof the solar thing is on. We
Or
just
if
want to
you're
breathe
King
cleaner air.
Supers and you have 5 stores in town, and you tell me the one on Harmony would benefit the system most, that tells the corporate masters at King Supers that we're ready to do solar in Fort Collins, we need to put it here.
Yeah, and that's a big research area or support area, I guess I'll say, that we work on at the lab to do these real-time simulations, or, you know, not real-time, you know, more detailed simulations or modeling of the system, and determine what those are. So I feel like I can safely say we can give you a pretty good idea of where to put stuff and where not to put it. We certainly would partner with the utility, whoever owns those lines and whoever operates those substations, to get an understanding of what those systems are. We need a lot of information to do that kind of thing. So it's kind of a partnership, but that's been done.
Jim in the back, right?
The subject matter overall is getting the renewables 100% or as much as we can. And we spent all evening talking about nothing but electricity. So I'm asking whether or not we should be looking at some other areas of renewables that are available or might be available out there besides just handling electricity in different ways. I mean, we're talking about alternating currents and direct currents, sensitive frequencies and all. Is there another form of energy that we can talk about, or is there another form of renewable, another view that we can have of the bigger problem of renewables, other
Well, I don't know, at the end of the day, the problems are with variability and you've got variable generation and variable load, and that's in making the system work. I mean, it really is a system problem, as opposed to just ramping up generation to follow load.
So my question was, maybe not well phrased. Let's take electricity out of the subject to talk about for a while, and look at other forms of renewable energy being used or put into the system. Is there anything going on out there, or can you discuss any other forms of energy besides electricity? We touched upon hydrogen a little bit, but nothing else to speak of. Is there anything else going on out there we're looking at?
I'll take. So I think the reason I think we tend to focus on electricity is a source form independent delivery system. Okay, right? So you can have many different sources, many different forms. You deliver one product, electricity. It therefore makes hybridization much easier, right? So when you get to the other two big systems, which is liquid fuels that are primarily used for transportation. Nowadays, there's not much being used for other stuff, and gas transmission. Now you're in a source form dependent method. Okay, you have to match a certain format of power delivery, and that puts other constraints on. So on the gas system side, for example, there's a fair amount of work going on in California, for example, to catch biogas and to put methane into the natural gas system, for example. Those are the problem with most of those solutions is that it's very dispersed, and it's the cleaning process of getting the methane to a level that you can mix it into the natural gas stream and meet the specifications of the gas that comes out of the other end is a really quite energy intensive and chemically intensive process, right? So it's been tough to do that. That's the only, there's been some liquid fuel stuff going on as well. There's some people here in the building actually who've been working on that. That's an even tougher problem than the gas problem. So I think that's one of the reasons why we end up on electricity when we come to renewables all the time. It's because it's source form independent.
Right, but in some cases, like we're using a lot of places there's electric heat, and electric heat is significantly less efficient than, what?
It's 100%.
A very efficient furnace, that's more efficient than a very efficient electric generator. Is that
It's
not
cheaper.
true?
No, ground source heat pump is very efficient.
If you had ground source heat pumps, right now we have a lot of them are just going through resistors. They're 100% efficient conversion.
Let's kind of pull it back in. Let's kind of
renewables.
But let's kind of pull it back in because we are focusing on electricity just for the scope, and thermal and other and liquid fuels are a little bit out of the scope, and we are kind of pushing up on time. So
I want to get back to the big picture. Historically, electricity has been generated in large centralized power plants and pushed out through a distribution system to the edges. The revolution that we are going through now is allowing us to change the way this grid operates. We can now flow electricity in two directions. It doesn't have to all flow one way. In the electric utility industry, we talk about distributed energy resources, moving generators to the grid edge, which is, rooftop solar, community solar gardens, wind, whatever, but it's moving out to the edge. To have a transactive energy market, which I believe we need to have and will get to eventually, the question is how long will it take? But it's also true that the average guy doesn't want to be sitting at his phone, trying to figure out if he can make a buck by selling his electricity now instead of 5 minutes from now. That's not going to happen. So what's happening now is various vendors are coming out with software packages called Distributed Energy Resource Management Systems, DERMS, which they are marketing to do this automatically. This, to me, is an opportunity for electric utilities to step in and say, we are providing our customers a service. We're not just selling them electricity. We are providing them with the energy management, and by aggregating all of the individual customers together in a virtual power plant, we can make things happen that benefits everybody. This, I believe, is where we need to be going.
Very quickly, comments?
Well, other than we agree. I mean, that's where we're trying to get to. It's just that it's complicated. It's not a plug-and-play system where we can just buy something off the shelf. We hope we get there. We hope we get a single platform where it's easy to implement.
I'm going to do 2 more questions. This gentleman in the middle, and then I'll go to the gentleman in the blue.
Just one economic question. So what is currently the generating cost for using fossil fuels, wind, solar? How do you envision that 5 years from now and 10 years from now?
I didn't hear that. Did you say the cost?
So what is the per kilowatt generating cost for fossil, for wind, for solar today? And how do you see that changing 5 years from now and 10 years from now going forwards?
Yeah, I guess I'll start out by, I'm not sure that's the right question, because I don't know if we can just compare those different resources, because the wind doesn't always blow. The sun isn't always out, and so we still have to serve the load during those other times as well.
I understand, and there's also the capital costs associated with each, but per unit, just a comparison, how do you see that changing in relative terms over time?
I think it's gonna, right now, wind, if you look at it just on a per unit incremental cost, out-of-pocket cost, wind's probably the cheapest, and then coal, some coal resources, and then solar. As just on a per unit, not looking at utilization factors or anything else, but that's because of the tax credits, that are in place for the next few years yet. And then I think you'll see a pretty significant increase in wind prices, and solar will bump up a little bit. But I think solar will continue to drop as well. So I don't know if the tax credit, if the tax credit will be offset or not by the overall reduction in solar. So I mean, I know it's not a very good answer, but I mean, based on your question, that's the best I can give you. But I think overall, I mean, coal is still going to be cheaper if you look at it without any of the externalities or other factors.
And there's also Lazard's levelized cost of energy, LCOE analysis is really good. They've been doing it for 12 years. That's a really good resource as well.
So before we go off this, let me comment on something here so I can stir up my utility colleagues. One of the interesting things going on right now, and there's a Lawrence Berkeley Labs report on this that was done by Barbosa company, is that over the kind of the lifespan of the electric system, going back into the 50s at least, roughly the load growth and the capital reinvestment requirements of the electric system have been about balanced. So kind of the amount of electricity sold and the amount of capital you have to put back into the power system to keep it operating have been about growing at roughly the same percentage. And starting a few years back, the load growth is flattened out, okay? And so what you're seeing now is utility costs, the reinvestment costs of just keeping the equipment running, replacing aging, that sort of thing, is now moving away from the per unit sales cost, okay? So when they looked at sort of total cost of utility provision of energy, the thing that comes up as the largest driver of the cost of electricity is the need, is basically what you need for capital reinvestment on a relatively flat to declining sales base. Okay, so on a per kilowatt hour. So I would go back to kind of what you said, is that I challenge you to ask some different questions than just the price of generation and new generation replacement. So I think the problem is a lot more interrelated than that. We've got aging equipment, we've got new corridor problems, we've got shifting population bases, and it's all being laid on top of a flat to declining electric consumption rate, which in general is a good idea from efficiency perspective, but it produces some financial challenges for the industry that are kind of non-trivial.
So it's sort of akin to balance of system costs are going up.
Correct, and it's an aging system in a lot of places. Now, here in Fort Collins, where we're kind of growing, probably for Platte River as well, sort of growing, we're not seeing it as much as they're seeing it in kind of rural areas of the U.S. where a lot of their equipment is getting very close to its, well, it's way past its design life, okay, but it's getting very close to its practical life.
Okay, last question.
How's it going, Pete?
Doing great.
Thanks for putting on this talk. I'd still like to see these discussions circle back to scalable, low-cost good ideas. I mean, we've got some, we're in the ether here for me, you know, but there must be 30,000 permanent split capacitor blower motors in residential properties here in Fort Collins. I work on a couple hundred houses a year, new construction, old construction, and there isn't a single HVAC contractor in town that pushes DC brushless blower motors. Nobody, it's an extra $300 or $400. That'll pay for itself faster than upgrading from an 80% to a 96% on the natural gas side. The electricity savings is what I'm getting at. And when you get done, a few, you know, little fancy footwork, drop the static pressure in the ductwork, that PCS is pulling 8, 9, 10 amps, okay, and moving less air than a DC brushless pulling 4 amps. And there's 35,000 of them running right now in Fort Collins. I mean, it's as easy to, it's not as easy to swap out as an LED light bulb, but an HVAC guy needs about 2 hours in the mechanical room once he gets down there to do it. The motor costs $240 wholesale. And these are the kind of like low-cost good ideas that would get us way closer to these, you know, carbon neutral or 100% renewable goals, like off the shelf, out the door, $240, 2 or 3 man-hours labor, and everybody's saving 900 kilowatt hours a year, you know, which takes a couple months off your base, off your annual consumption at peak, probably most of the time. You know, so I guess the big idea is to, you know, maybe sort of
not forget about energy efficiency.
not forget about the low-cost good idea. You talk about low-hanging fruit, you know, there's a bunch of that that's still out there. All the student housing and, you know, new construction. I don't see one ECM or DC brushless motor on a new furnace in 100, maybe in 300.
So we're doing a project right now with NREL on DC distribution systems for commercial buildings. So it's not the low-hanging fruit, but it's like the one you have to get from a step stool. And the whole thing around that is that if you look at that DC converter that's hanging up right there in the corner of the room, okay, so all the volts and all the lighting in here is 12 volt or 24 volt DC, except for these can lights. And but that converter is about a 95%, 97% efficient converter. The brick you have on your computer is about 85 on a good day with a following wind. And so what we've been looking at is what kind of advantage you could get from converting a bunch of your miscellaneous electric loads in commercial buildings over to DC, which is not as simple as swapping out motors on your HVAC system, but it's kind of like the next tier up. And, you know, that looks like it has some, you know, it's non-trivial amounts of savings that can be, you can get a non-trivial amount of savings from that, but there are a lot of pieces that have to fall in place for that to be true. So we're actually, our project is trying to say, well, is it worth getting the pieces in place? Is it a big enough target?
Well, with that, I definitely want to thank